The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of the Chen family's two-story suburban home. Thomas Chen sat in his home office, his fingers dancing across the keyboard as he tried to finish a crucial software project. At 45, he had spent the last 20 years building a comfortable life with his wife Sarah, and their modern house in a quiet neighborhood was testament to their success. The wall clock showed 7:30 p.m. when Thomas first heard his wife's hushed voice drifting up from the kitchen below. You wouldn't have paid much attention to it normally. Sarah often made phone calls in the evening, but something about her tone made him pause his typing. It was different from her usual cheerful manner, more secretive and serious. "Yes, I understand the process," Sarah was saying, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to be careful about the timing of the inheritance transfer. Thomas doesn't know anything about this yet." Thomas's hands froze above his keyboard. His heart began to beat faster as he heard his name mentioned. Inheritance? What inheritance? He and Sarah had always been open about their finances. They shared everything, or at least, he thought they did. "The amount is substantial," Sarah continued, unaware that her husband could hear every word. "We're talking about enough to completely change our lives. But the paperwork needs to be handled delicately." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. He silently pushed his chair back from his desk and moved closer to his office door, straining to hear more clearly. The wooden floorboards creaked slightly under his feet, and he held his breath, afraid that Sarah might hear him. "I know it's a lot of responsibility," Sarah's voice continued, "but I've already spoken with the financial advisor. He says everything can be arranged within the next few months. We just need to make sure all the legal aspects are covered." Thomas's mind raced with questions. Was Sarah expecting some kind of inheritance he didn't know about? But why keep it secret from him? They had been married for 15 years, sharing every joy and hardship. The thought that she might be hiding something this significant made his stomach twist with anxiety. He heard Sarah's footsteps moving across the kitchen floor, and her voice became slightly clearer as she approached the bottom of the stairs. "Yes, I understand the risks involved, but this is too important to mess up. I'll need to schedule another meeting with the lawyer next week." Thomas quietly retreated to his desk chair, his project completely forgotten. His computer screen had gone dark, and in its reflection, he could see his own troubled expression. He ran his hands through his graying hair, trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. The house fell silent as Sarah apparently ended her call. Thomas could hear her moving around in the kitchen, probably starting to prepare dinner as she did every evening. Everything sounded so normal, so routine, but now it felt like a facade hiding something much more complicated. He tried to return to his work, but the lines of code on his screen might as well have been in a foreign language. His mind kept replaying fragments of Sarah's conversation: inheritance transfer, substantial amount, change our lives. The words echoed in his head, taking on darker meanings with each repetition. Sarah's voice floated up the stairs, cheerful and normal as ever. "Thomas, dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. "Okay, honey," he called back, surprised at how steady his own voice sounded despite the turmoil inside. "I'll just finish up here." But as he sat there in his dimly lit office, Thomas Chen knew something had fundamentally changed. The foundation of trust he thought was unshakable had developed its first crack. Questions multiplied in his mind. Was there more to his wife than he knew? What else might she be hiding? And most troubling of all, why would she need to keep an inheritance secret from him unless she had plans that didn't include him? The familiar sounds of cooking continued from below, the clatter of pots, the running water, the soft humming that was so characteristically Sarah. But to Thomas, it all seemed different now, as if he were listening to a performance rather than the natural rhythms of their shared life. He saved his work automatically, his thoughts already turning to how he could uncover the truth behind Sarah's mysterious phone call. One thing was certain: this evening marked the beginning of a journey that would test their marriage in ways he never could have imagined. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas Chen began to notice things he had never paid attention to before. Small details that once seemed innocent now appeared suspicious through the lens of his growing anxiety. He found himself watching Sarah's every move, analyzing her daily routines with the precision he usually reserved for debugging complex computer code. Sarah's phone became the center of his attention. He noticed how she would quickly end calls when he entered the room, or step outside to the backyard to speak in private. Sometimes he caught fragments of conversations: "Yes, everything is proceeding as planned," or We'll need to move carefully with this." Each whispered word felt like another stone added to the weight in his stomach. One Tuesday morning, as Thomas pretended to read the news on his tablet at the breakfast table, he watched Sarah check her calendar. She had started scheduling mysterious appointments, marking them with only initials, MR or FA. When he casually asked about them, she would smile and say they were just routine meetings for her volunteer work at the community center. But Thomas knew better. Sarah had taken a sudden interest in their financial documents, spending hours in their home office when she thought he was asleep. He had found browser histories showing searches for estate planning and life insurance policies. The websites she visited painted a troubling picture, one that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling while Sarah slept peacefully beside him. The most concerning development came when Thomas spotted Sarah leaving a local cafe one afternoon. He had left work early, planning to surprise her with dinner plans, when he saw her through the cafe window. She was sitting with a well-dressed man he didn't recognize, papers spread across the table between them. Sarah's face was serious, nodding as the man pointed to different documents. Thomas parked his car across the street, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He watched as Sarah gathered the papers into a manila envelope, shook hands with the mysterious man, and left the cafe. She never mentioned the meeting to Thomas that evening. The changes in Sarah extended beyond her secretive meetings. She had started asking unusual questions about his work schedule, showing particular interest in the days he worked late. She made careful notes about his routine, something she had never done before in their 15 years of marriage. Even her cooking habits changed. Sarah had always been health-conscious, but now she seemed obsessed with preparing heart-healthy meals. She replaced Thomas's beloved bacon with turkey alternatives and started measuring his portions carefully. When he joked about her sudden interest in his cholesterol levels, she became defensive and changed the subject. One evening, as Thomas sat in his home office pretending to work, he overheard another of Sarah's phone conversations. This time, she was speaking to someone about insurance policies. "Yes, I understand the terms," she said softly. "The policy needs to be active for at least 3 months before." "Yes, I know." "No, he hasn't noticed anything different. Everything is going according to plan." Thomas felt his blood run cold. The pieces were starting to form a terrifying picture. The secret meetings, the financial research, the focus on his health, the insurance discussions. Was Sarah planning something sinister? The thought seemed impossible when he looked at his wife's gentle face, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. That night during dinner, Thomas watched Sarah more carefully than ever. She had prepared his favorite meal, grilled salmon with roasted vegetables. As she served him a generous portion, her hands steady and her smile warm, he wondered how well he really knew the woman he had shared his life with for so long. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked, noticing his distant expression. "You barely touched your food." "Just tired from work," Thomas lied, forcing himself to take a bite. The food tasted like ash in his mouth. As he lay in bed that night, listening to Sarah's gentle breathing beside him, Thomas made a decision. He couldn't continue living with these suspicions and fears. He needed to know the truth, even if it destroyed everything he held dear. With a racing mind, he began to formulate a plan, one that would either confirm his worst fears or prove him terribly wrong. Thomas spent 3 sleepless nights researching on his laptop, the blue light illuminating his worried face as he clicked through medical websites and health forums. His plan was dangerous, perhaps even foolish, but desperation had taken over his rational mind. He would fake a heart attack to test Sarah's true intentions. Every night, after Sarah fell asleep, Thomas carefully studied the symptoms of cardiac arrest. He learned about chest pain patterns, breathing difficulties, and the way people typically collapse during such episodes. He even watched videos of heart attack survivors describing their experiences, taking mental notes of every detail. During his lunch breaks at work, Thomas practiced falling safely in his office, making sure he could collapse without actually hurting himself. He rehearsed different facial expressions in his bathroom mirror, perfecting the look of sudden, intense chest pain. The software engineer in him approached this simulation like debugging a complex program. Every detail had to be perfect. The hardest part was choosing the right moment. It had to be when they were alone, with no chance of interruption. Thomas monitored Sarah's schedule, noting that she usually spent Sunday afternoons at home, often reading or working on her laptop in the living room. This would be his stage. As part of his preparation, Thomas rearranged some furniture in their living room, creating a clear space where he could fall without hitting anything. He also made sure their first aid kit was easily accessible. Not that he expected to need it, but it had to look authentic. One detail particularly concerned him. How long should he maintain the charade? Too short, and he might miss Sarah's genuine reaction. Too long, and she might call emergency services. After careful consideration, Thomas decided 3 minutes would be enough time to gauge her response while avoiding unnecessary complications. The plan consumed his thoughts. During dinner conversations, while Sarah talked about her day, Thomas found himself mentally rehearsing his performance. He noticed his hands shaking slightly as he ate, and hoped Sarah wouldn't notice his nervous energy. "Are you feeling all right?" Sarah asked one evening, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "You seem distracted lately." "Just some pressure at work," Thomas replied, managing a weak smile. The irony of lying about his health wasn't lost on him. The night before his planned performance, Thomas could barely sleep. He lay awake, listening to Sarah's steady breathing beside him, wondering if he was making a terrible mistake. But then he remembered the hushed phone calls, the secret meetings, the insurance discussions, and his resolve strengthened. Sunday morning arrived with a strange sense of calm. Thomas watched Sarah go through her normal routine, making coffee, reading the news on her tablet, doing some light housework. Every movement she made seemed significant now, loaded with potential meaning. He had chosen 2:30 p.m. as the optimal time. Sarah would be settled into her afternoon routine, and the neighbors would likely be busy with their own activities. Thomas set his watch to vibrate at the designated time, giving himself a final countdown. As the hours ticked by, Thomas felt like an actor preparing for the most important performance of his life. He changed into comfortable clothes that wouldn't restrict his movement. He made sure his phone was in his pocket, set to silent mode. He even took a small sip of water, careful not to drink too much. Unconscious people don't swallow after all. At 2:15, Thomas began his final preparations. He walked around the house, double-checking that everything was in place. Sarah was in the living room, just as he predicted, reading a novel on their comfortable sofa. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, creating the perfect lighting for his dramatic scene. His watch vibrated against his wrist. It was time. Thomas took a deep breath, steadying himself for what was to come. In his mind, he ran through the sequence one final time. Clutch chest, stumble slightly, gasp for air, then collapse. He would fall forward, turning slightly to land on his side. His eyes would remain slightly open but unfocused, his breathing shallow but visible. As he walked toward the living room, Thomas felt a moment of doubt. Was he really going to go through with this? But then he heard Sarah's phone buzz, saw her quickly silence it with a furtive glance in his direction, and his determination returned. It was now or never. Thomas Chen was about to find out if his wife of 15 years was plotting his death, or if he had let his imagination run wild with paranoia. Either way, their lives would never be the same after the next 3 minutes. The living room was quiet except for the gentle rustling of pages as Sarah read her book. Thomas stood in the doorway, his heart pounding so hard he worried it might actually trigger a real medical emergency. He took a few steps into the room, making sure he was in Sarah's line of sight. "Honey," he called out softly, beginning his carefully rehearsed performance. "I think I need some water." His voice trembled slightly, not part of the act, but rather genuine nervousness that only added to the authenticity of the moment. Sarah looked up from her book, and Thomas clutched his chest. He made sure to grab the left side, just as his research had indicated. His face contorted in what he hoped was a convincing display of sudden, severe pain. A gasp escaped his lips, not too dramatic, but sharp enough to catch Sarah's attention. "Thomas?" Sarah's voice carried a note of concern. She placed her book down, marking her place with a bookmark, a strangely casual gesture that Thomas noted even in his focused state. He staggered slightly, using the back of the armchair for support. His breathing became labored, each inhale a deliberate struggle. Thomas had practiced this part extensively, making sure to wheeze in a way that sounded realistic rather than theatrical. "My chest," he managed to gasp out. Sarah was now standing, her face showing the first signs of real worry. Thomas watched her reactions through half-closed eyes, trying to spot any sign of guilty knowledge or calculated response. The moment of his collapse had to be perfect. Too sudden would look fake, too slow would seem deliberate. Thomas let his knees buckle gradually, his body swaying as if fighting against gravity. He kept his eyes on Sarah's face as he began his controlled fall. "Thomas." Sarah's voice rose in pitch. She took a step toward him, her hands outstretched. Thomas noticed they were trembling. Was it fear for his life, or fear that her plans were being disrupted? The descent felt like it took forever, though in reality it was only seconds. Thomas made sure to land on his side, just as he had practiced, protecting his head while maintaining a position that looked naturally uncomfortable. His right arm splayed out at an awkward angle, his left hand still clutched at his chest. Sarah rushed to his side, dropping to her knees beside him. "Thomas, can you hear me?" Her hands hovered over his body, shaking visibly now. Through his nearly closed eyes, Thomas studied her every movement, every expression. He kept his breathing shallow but visible, remembering his research about unconscious patients. His body remained limp as Sarah gently shook his shoulder, calling his name with increasing urgency. The carpet beneath him was soft, making his position more comfortable than he had anticipated. "Oh God, oh God," Sarah repeated, her voice cracking. She fumbled for her phone, nearly dropping it in her panic. Thomas watched through his eyelashes as she struggled to unlock the screen, her fingers trembling so badly she had to try 3 times. "911, what's your emergency?" Thomas could faintly hear the dispatcher's voice through the phone speaker. "My husband." Sarah's voice was almost unrecognizable, high-pitched and broken with fear. "I think he's having a heart attack. Please, please send help." She rattled off their address between sobs that seemed to shake her entire body. Thomas felt a moment of doubt as he watched tears stream down Sarah's face. Her fear looked genuine. Wasn't that what a guilty person would try to convey? "The dispatcher says I need to start CPR," Sarah said, her hands already moving to position themselves on his chest. This wasn't part of Thomas's plan. He hadn't considered she might attempt chest compressions. Just as Sarah's palms pressed against his sternum, Thomas made his decision. He couldn't let this go any further. He opened his eyes fully and grabbed her wrist, stopping her before she could begin compressions. "Sarah, wait," he said, his voice hoarse but clear. The look on Sarah's face was one he would never forget, a complex mixture of shock, relief, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite identify. She sat back on her heels, one hand still gripping her phone, the other trembling in his grasp. "Thomas?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. What's happening?" The moment had come. Thomas slowly pushed himself up to a sitting position, preparing to face the consequences of his deception, even as the dispatcher's voice continued to call out from Sarah's phone, asking if everything was all right. Sarah stared at Thomas with wide, tear-filled eyes, her phone slipping from her trembling fingers onto the carpet. The 911 dispatcher's voice continued to call out, becoming background noise to the intense moment between husband and wife. "I need to tell them you're okay," Sarah whispered, picking up the phone with shaking hands. Her voice cracked as she spoke to the dispatcher. "I'm sorry. He's conscious now." "Yes, I understand. Thank you." She ended the call and turned back to Thomas, her face a mask of confusion and fear. But instead of the relief Thomas expected to see, Sarah's expression transformed into something entirely different. Her features contorted with a mixture of panic and anguish as the reality of what had just happened sank in. "Why weren't you answering me?" she screamed suddenly, her voice raw with emotion. "Do you know what that felt like? I thought you were dying." She began to hit his chest with her open palms, not hard enough to hurt, but with the desperate energy of someone who had just faced their worst nightmare. Thomas caught her wrists gently, surprised by the intensity of her reaction. This wasn't the calculated response of someone whose plans had been disrupted. This was pure, unfiltered fear and relief colliding in a storm of emotion. "Sarah, he began, but she cut him off. "Don't you dare try to explain right now," she choked out between sobs. I need a minute." She pulled away from him and stumbled to her feet, swaying slightly as she made her way to the kitchen. Thomas sat on the floor, listening to the sounds of Sarah running water and taking deep breaths. His carefully constructed plan was unraveling in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her reaction seemed too raw, too genuine to be an act. When Sarah returned, Her face was wet from splashing water, but her eyes were clearer. She carried a glass of water, which she thrust at Thomas with trembling hands. "Drink this," she commanded, her voice still unsteady but firm. Thomas took the glass, noting how Sarah watched him take each sip, as if afraid he might collapse again at any moment. When he finished, she took the glass and set it aside with deliberate care. "Now," she said, sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of him, "you're going to tell me exactly what just happened. And Thomas Chen, I swear to God, if you lie to me right now." The threat hung unfinished in the air between them. Thomas looked at his wife, really looked at her. Her mascara was smeared from tears, her usually neat hair disheveled from running her hands through it in distress. Her whole body seemed to vibrate with suppressed emotion. "I heard you," he said finally, his voice quiet. "On the phone, talking about inheritance and insurance policies. The secret meetings, the whispered conversations. I thought." Sarah's face changed as he spoke, moving through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and then something that looked almost like horror. "You thought I was." She couldn't even finish the sentence. Her hand flew to her mouth as the full implication of his actions hit her. "Oh my God. You thought I was planning to." Fresh tears welled up in her eyes, but these were different from the earlier ones. These were tears of hurt, of betrayal, of disbelief that her husband could think her capable of such a thing. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. 15 years, Thomas. 15 years we've been married, and you thought I was capable of." The pain in her voice cut through Thomas like a knife. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself as if for protection. "Sarah, please," he started, but she shook her head. "No, you need to listen now," she said, her voice gaining strength even as tears continued to fall. "Because what you just did, pretending to be dying to test me, that was cruel. But what I've been planning, what I've been trying to keep secret." She took a deep breath, seeming to make a decision. "I think it's time you knew the truth about the inheritance," she said firmly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "But after what you just put me through, I don't even know where to begin." Sarah stared at Thomas with wide, tear-filled eyes, her phone slipping from her trembling fingers onto the carpet. The 911 dispatcher's voice continued to call out, becoming background noise to the intense moment between husband and wife. "I need to tell them you're okay," Sarah whispered, picking up the phone with shaking hands. Her voice cracked as she spoke to the dispatcher. "I'm sorry. He's conscious now." "Yes, I understand. Thank you." She ended the call and turned back to Thomas, her face a mask of confusion and fear. But instead of the relief Thomas expected to see, Sarah's expression transformed into something entirely different. Her features contorted with a mixture of panic and anguish as the reality of what had just happened sank in. "Why weren't you answering me?" she screamed suddenly, her voice raw with emotion. "Do you know what that felt like? I thought you were dying." She began to hit his chest with her open palms, not hard enough to hurt, but with the desperate energy of someone who had just faced their worst nightmare. Thomas caught her wrists gently, surprised by the intensity of her reaction. This wasn't the calculated response of someone whose plans have been disrupted. This was pure, unfiltered fear and relief colliding in a storm of emotion. "Sarah, he began, but she cut him off. "Don't you dare try to explain right now," she choked out between sobs. I need a minute." She pulled away from him and stumbled to her feet, swaying slightly as she made her way to the kitchen. Thomas sat on the floor, listening to the sounds of Sarah running water and taking deep breaths. His carefully constructed plan was unraveling in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her reaction seemed too raw, too genuine to be an act. When Sarah returned, her face was wet from splashing water, but her eyes were clearer. She carried a glass of water, which she thrust at Thomas with trembling hands. "Drink this," she commanded, her voice still unsteady but firm. Thomas took the glass, noting how Sarah watched him take each sip as if afraid he might collapse again at any moment. When he finished, she took the glass and set it aside with deliberate care. "Now," she said, sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of him, "you're going to tell me exactly what just happened. And Thomas Chen, I swear to God, if you lie to me right now." The threat hung unfinished in the air between them. Thomas looked at his wife, really looked at her, Her mascara was smeared from tears, her usually neat hair disheveled from running her hands through it in distress. Her whole body seemed to vibrate with suppressed emotion. "I heard you," he said finally, his voice quiet. "On the phone, talking about inheritance and insurance policies. The secret meetings, the whispered conversations. I thought." Sarah's face changed as he spoke, moving through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and then something that looked almost like horror. "You thought I was—" She couldn't even finish the sentence. Her hand flew to her mouth as the full implication of his actions hit her. "Oh my God, you thought I was planning to. Fresh tears welled up in her eyes, but these were different from the earlier ones. These were tears of hurt, of betrayal, of disbelief that her husband could think her capable of such a thing. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. 15 years, Thomas. 15 years we've been married, and you thought I was capable of." The pain in her voice cut through Thomas like a knife. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself as if for protection. "Sarah, please," he started, but she shook her head. "No, you need to listen now," she said, her voice gaining strength even as tears continued to fall. "Because what you just did, pretending to be dying to test me, that was cruel. But what I've been planning, what I've been trying to keep secret." She took a deep breath, seeming to make a decision. "I think it's time you knew the truth about the inheritance," she said firmly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "But after what you just put me through, I don't even know where to begin." The silence in the living room was heavy with tension as Sarah collected her thoughts. Thomas remained seated on the floor, watching his wife struggle with emotions he had never seen so raw and exposed on her face before. "Do you remember my grandmother, Rose?" Sarah finally asked, her voice steadier now. "The one who helped raise me after my parents died?" Thomas nodded slowly. He remembered the kind elderly woman who had passed away 2 years ago. Sarah had been devastated by the loss but had handled the grief privately, as she did with most difficult emotions. "What you don't know," Sarah continued, "is that Grandma Rose had a special connection with our nephew, Jimmy." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "She saw how much we struggled to provide for his special needs, how your sister Lisa could barely afford his therapy sessions." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Jimmy, his sister's 8-year-old son, had been diagnosed with severe autism 3 years ago. The family had been struggling with the mounting medical and therapeutic expenses ever since. "Before she died," Sarah went on, her voice catching slightly, "Grandma Rose set up a trust fund. She made me the executor, but she wanted it to be specifically for Jimmy's care. The inheritance you heard me talking about, it wasn't for me, it was never about me." The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. All his suspicions, his elaborate plans, his fears, they crumbled in the face of this simple truth. Sarah stood up and walked to the nearby bookshelf, pulling out a thick manila envelope from behind some books. "These are the papers from the financial advisor and the lawyer. I've been working with them to structure the trust fund properly. It's a substantial amount, Thomas. Enough to ensure Jimmy gets the care he needs through his adult life." She spread the documents on the coffee table. Thomas could see complex legal terminology, trust fund structures, and most importantly, Jimmy's name clearly printed on several pages. "I wanted to surprise you." Sarah's voice cracked again. "I wanted to have everything properly arranged before telling you and Lisa. Do you know how hard it's been keeping this from you? From everyone? But I needed to make sure everything was legally sound first." Thomas stared at the papers, then at his wife. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a physical burden. The health-conscious meals, the questions about my schedule. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "I was trying to find the perfect time to tell you. And yes, I started cooking healthier because the stress of keeping this secret was affecting my anxiety, and my therapist suggested focusing on healthy habits might help." She picked up one of the documents, her hands still trembling slightly. "The insurance discussions you heard? They were about setting up a special needs trust insurance policy for Jimmy to supplement the trust fund. I was trying to understand all the legal requirements before presenting everything to you and Lisa." Thomas felt physically ill. "Sarah, I don't know what to say." "Do you know what makes this even worse?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I saw you collapse, all I could think about was how I couldn't lose you before sharing this with you, How terrible it would be if you died thinking I was just some secretive wife, never knowing that I was trying to do something good for our family. She wiped fresh tears from her eyes. And now I find out that you actually thought I was capable of wanting you dead? For money? After everything we've been through together? Thomas reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away, though her fingers remained limp in his grasp. I was so wrong, he admitted, his voice hoarse with emotion. I let my imagination run wild instead of trusting you, instead of just asking you directly. Yes, you did, Sarah agreed, but her tone had softened slightly. And now we have to figure out how to move forward from this. But first, she squared her shoulders, gathering her composure. We need to call Lisa. It's time she knew about Grandma Rose's gift to Jimmy. And after that, she looked directly into Thomas's eyes. You and I have a lot of trust to rebuild. Thomas nodded, understanding that the revelation of the truth was just the beginning of what would be a long journey back to the trust they once shared. The days following Thomas's fake heart attack and Sarah's revelation were filled with a strange mixture of emotions in the Chen household. The truth about Grandma Rose's trust fund had come out, but the damage to Thomas and Sarah's relationship cast a shadow over what should have been a joyous revelation. Lisa, Thomas's sister, had broken down in tears when they told her about the trust fund for Jimmy. She had hugged Sarah for nearly 5 minutes, repeating "thank you" through her sobs while Thomas stood awkwardly to the side, the weight of his recent actions making it difficult for him to fully share in the moment. This will change everything for Jimmy, Lisa had said, watching her son playing with his favorite toy train in the corner of their living room. We can get him the specialized therapy he needs, maybe even enroll him in that special needs program we couldn't afford before. But while Lisa's gratitude brought some light to the situation, the tension between Thomas and Sarah remained palpable. They moved around their house like strangers, their usual comfortable routine replaced by careful politeness and avoided gazes. Thomas found himself sleeping in the guest room, not because Sarah had asked him to, but because he couldn't bear to lie next to her and feel the distance between them. Each night, he would stare at the unfamiliar ceiling, replaying his actions and wondering how he could have let his fears spiral so far out of control. At work, Thomas couldn't focus on his coding projects. His team noticed his distraction, but he couldn't explain that he had pretended to have a heart attack to test his wife's loyalty. The absurdity of his actions hit him harder each time he thought about it. Sarah, meanwhile, threw herself into finalizing the trust fund arrangements. She spent long hours with the lawyers and financial advisors, coming home late with red-rimmed eyes that spoke of more than just tiredness. The manila envelope of documents sat prominently on their dining room table, a constant reminder of both her loving intentions and his devastating mistake. One evening, about a week after the incident, Thomas found a business card on his pillow in the guest room. It was for a marriage counselor. When he went downstairs, he found Sarah sitting in the kitchen, clutching a cup of tea. I made an appointment for next Thursday, she said quietly, not looking up from her cup. If you want to try to fix this, I mean. Thomas sat down across from her, his throat tight. Of course I want to fix this, he managed to say. I'll do anything, Sarah. Anything to make this right. I don't know if it can be made right, Sarah replied, finally meeting his eyes. But I think we owe it to our 15 years together to try. And, she hesitated, I need to understand how we got here. How you could think I would want to harm you. The first counseling session was brutal. Thomas had to explain his suspicions while Sarah listened, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The counselor, Dr. Martinez, helped them navigate through the painful conversation, guiding them to examine the breakdown in communication that had led to this point. Trust is like a mirror, Dr. Martinez had explained. Once it's broken, you can try to fix it, but the crack might always be visible. The question is whether you're both willing to look past those cracks and build something new. The process was slow and painful. Some days, it felt like they were making progress. Sarah would share a small smile with Thomas over breakfast, or their hands would brush accidentally while doing dishes. Other days, the weight of what had happened seemed insurmountable. Jimmy's first appointment at the new therapy center provided an unexpected turning point. Watching their nephew respond positively to the advanced treatment programs the trust fund made possible, Thomas and Sarah found themselves unconsciously drawing closer, their shared joy in Jimmy's progress creating a small bridge across the chasm between them. He's doing so well, Sarah had whispered, watching Jimmy interact with his new therapist. Thomas had tentatively placed his hand over hers, and for the first time since the incident, she didn't pull away. That evening, as they drove home in silence, both knew that while their relationship would never be the same, perhaps it could be rebuilt into something different, something that acknowledged past mistakes while carefully constructing a new foundation of trust. 6 months had passed since the day Thomas faked his heart attack, and the Chen household had gradually found a new rhythm. While the memory of that day would never completely fade, Thomas and Sarah had worked hard to rebuild their relationship, one careful step at a time. Through weekly sessions with Dr. Martinez, they had learned to identify the patterns that had led to their crisis. Thomas discovered that his tendency to internalize worries rather than express them had roots in his childhood, while Sarah realized that her desire to handle everything perfectly on her own sometimes shut others out. The trust fund was just one example, Sarah admitted during a particularly meaningful therapy session. I always try to make everything perfect before sharing it, but in doing so, I forget that marriage means facing challenges together. The turning point in their recovery came unexpectedly during one of Jimmy's therapy sessions. They were watching him master a particularly challenging communication exercise when Thomas suddenly broke down. "I almost ruined everything," he whispered, tears rolling down his face. "Not just us, but this too. If my stupid suspicions had destroyed our marriage, it might have affected Jimmy's trust fund somehow." Sarah had taken his hand then, squeezing it gently. "But it didn't," she said softly. "We're still here, and Jimmy is getting the help he needs. Maybe that's what we need to focus on." As winter turned to spring, Thomas and Sarah began speaking at support groups for families with special needs children. They shared their story, not just about the trust fund, but about how their own crisis had almost derailed their ability to help others. Their honesty about their struggles resonated with other couples facing similar stresses. "Sometimes the pressure of caring for a special needs child can strain a marriage," Sarah would explain to the groups. "But we learned that the solution isn't to carry the burden alone, or to let fear drive our actions. It's about learning to trust and communicate." At home, they developed new habits. Every Sunday evening became their truth time, where they would share any worries or concerns, no matter how small. Thomas learned to voice his anxieties instead of letting them fester, while Sarah practiced sharing her plans and ideas in their early stages, even if they weren't perfectly formed. Jimmy's progress became a source of joint pride and joy. The trust fund allowed him to access the best available therapies, and his development exceeded everyone's expectations. Lisa often told them that Grandma Rose would have been so proud of how her gift was being used. 1 year after the incident, Thomas and Sarah renewed their wedding vows in a small, intimate ceremony. The guest list included only family, close friends, and Dr. Martinez, who had helped them navigate their darkest days. During the ceremony, Thomas added an unplanned admission to his vows. "I promise to trust in your love, to believe in your goodness, and to never again let fear override faith in us." Sarah's response was equally heartfelt. "I promise to share both my successes and struggles, to let you be my partner in all things, and to remember that perfect plans are less important than perfect trust." The celebration afterward was held at Jimmy's therapy center, where he proudly showed guests his artwork and new communication skills. The sight of their nephew's progress served as a powerful reminder of what could have been lost and what had been saved. As they drove home that evening, Sarah reached over and took Thomas's hand. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked quietly. Thomas nodded, his grip tightening slightly. "Every day, but not with the same regret anymore. Now I think about how close we came to losing everything, and how lucky we are to have found our way back." "We're stronger now," Sarah said, looking out at the sunset. "Not despite what happened, but because of how we chose to handle it afterward." That night, as they lay in bed together, no longer separated by walls of distrust and misunderstanding, Thomas and Sarah reflected on their journey. They had learned that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt, but it required both partners to be willing to examine their mistakes, face their fears, and commit to growth. Their story became one of hope for other couples facing similar challenges, proving that even the darkest moments could lead to deeper understanding and stronger bonds. They had emerged from their crisis not just as survivors, but as advocates for honest communication and unwavering trust in relationships.